Ruth Ann Miller believed there were two kinds of silence. There was the vast, clean silence of the prairie at dusk, a quiet that settled over the land like a blessing. And then there was the silence in her father's house, a thick and punishing quiet that followed his pronouncements. At 28, she was an expert in the latter. She was a fixture in that silence, a piece of furniture that had failed to sell. Tonight, the silence was particularly loud. Mr. Abernathy, a doughy merchant with sweat stains under his arms, had come to call on her younger sister, Sarah. Sarah, at 17, was all lace and blushes, a perfect frontier bloom ready for picking. Ruth Ann had served the coffee, her movements economical and quiet, her gray dress the color of dust and resignation. She had been clearing the cups when her father, emboldened by the prospect of a favorable match, had clapped Mr. Abernathy on the shoulder. "A fine girl, my Sarah." He'd boomed his voice in the small parlor. "Best to marry them off young, before they get ideas. Not like some." His eyes, small and hard as pebbles, flicked to Ruth Ann. "Can't keep them on the shelf forever. They start to turn." Mr. Abernathy had offered a weak, uncomfortable laugh. Sarah had blushed deeper, a mixture of pity and embarrassment. But Ruth Ann had simply picked up the last cup and retreated to the kitchen, the words trailing her like burrs on a hem. "On the shelf. Too old to wed." Turned, she had heard them all before, in whispers and side glances from the woman, but to hear them spoken so plainly by her own father, as if discussing a sack of soured flour, was a particular kind of cruelty. It was the sound of a door being nailed shut. She washed the cups in the basin, the lye soap biting at the small cracks in her hands. She was not beautiful like Sarah. Her face was too thin, her eyes too serious, her hands too capable. Years of running a household her father was incapable of managing had worn the softness from her. She managed the ledgers, stretched the dwindling household funds, mended the clothes, and planted the garden that kept them from starving. Her value was in what she did, not in who she was, and her father saw no profit in that. The front door closed, signaling Mr. Abernathy's departure. She heard her father's heavy tread, then Sarah's lighter steps going up the stairs. She was safe for the night. She dried her hands on her apron and looked out the small kitchen window at the sliver of moon hanging over the dark plains. The silence of the prairie called to her, a clean and empty promise. It was a place where a woman was judged by her endurance, not her marriageability. But the house held her fast. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the edges of other people's conversations. The next day, a horse unlike any she had ever seen was tied to the hitching post outside their small house. It was a great black beast, its coat gleaming like polished coal even under a film of trail dust. It radiated power and impatience. The man who owned such a horse, she thought, would not be a man accustomed to waiting. When she entered the parlor with a tray of water, she saw him, Bridger. He didn't need an introduction. Every soul in the territory knew of him. He owned the Blackwood Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that pressed against the horizon in every direction. He was a myth as much as a man spoken of in terms of acreage and influence. He was tall, dressed in dark, practical clothes that were well made but unadorned. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved into hard lines that gave nothing away. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, startling gray, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. Her father was practically bowing, his voice slick with a deference he showed no one else. "A pleasure, Mr. Bridger, a true pleasure. What can I do for the most important man in the territory?" Bridger's gaze swept past her father and landed on Ruth Ann. It wasn't the appraising look men usually gave women. It was quick, dismissive, the way one might glance at a chair before sitting down. He was here for business, nothing more. He turned his attention back to her father, Miller. "I'm here about the section of land bordering my western pasture. The one with the creek. I'll pay a fair price." Her father licked his lips. "Ah, yes. The Clearwater section. A prime piece of property, the water rights alone." He began to posture, to bloviate, naming a price that was pure fantasy. Bridger didn't even blink. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. This is the land office assessment from last spring, and this. He produced another, is what you paid for it 2 years ago. I'm offering you triple that. That's more than fair. It's generous. Her father sputtered, caught in his lie. He began to argue about inflation, about potential, about the cost of improvements he had never made. He was quoting numbers from thin air, tangling himself in his own clumsy mathematics. Ruth Ann, standing by the door, felt a familiar ache of embarrassment. He was going to lose the deal. He was going to talk his way out of a fortune because of his pride and his ignorance. The property tax assessment was based on a rate of 2 cents per dollar of valuation, she said. Her voice quiet but clear in the sudden lull. You're quoting the valuation itself as the tax. The room went still. Her father's head whipped around, his face turning a blotchy red. Ruthan, you will be silent. This is men's business. But Bridger's gaze had shifted. It settled on her now. And for the first time, it was not dismissive. It was sharp, analytical. He looked from her to the papers in his hand, then back to her. He had seen the error, of course, but he had let her father talk, letting him dig his own hole. What he hadn't expected was for the drab woman in the corner to hand him the shovel. She's right, Bridger said, his voice flat. He folded the papers. My offer stands, triple what you paid, yes or no. Defeated, humiliated, her father mumbled his assent. The deal was struck. As Bridger prepared to leave, his eyes found Ruth Ann's one last time. There was no warmth in them, no kindness. There was something far more shocking. A flicker of acknowledgement. He didn't look at her like a woman. He looked at her like an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. He nodded once. A curt, almost imperceptible gesture, and then he was gone. The silence that descended on the house after he left was the most damning she had ever known. Her father did not speak to her for 3 days. A week later, the black horse was at the hitching post again. This time, Bridger did not ask for her father. He asked for her. When she came to the door, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, he stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking entirely out of place against the peeling paint of her father's house. Miss Miller, he said, his voice a low rumble. I have a business proposition for you. Her father appeared behind her, his eyes wide with suspicion and greed. A proposition for her? Bridger's gaze did not waver from Ruthan's face. My ledgers are a mess. My foreman is a fine man with a rope, but he can't make sense of a column of figures. I'm being supplied out of Kansas City, and I have a feeling I'm being bled dry. I need someone to audit my books, all of them. I'll pay you $5 a day, plus board at the ranch until the job is done. The sum was staggering. It was more money than she had ever held in her own hands in her entire life. It was a fortune. It was an escape. Her father stepped forward. Now, hold on. A young unmarried woman staying at a bachelor's ranch, her reputation. She'll have her own room in the main house, Bridger said, his voice cutting through the false piety. My housekeeper, Martha, will be there. Her reputation will be safer there than anywhere in this town. This is a business arrangement, Miller. Nothing more. He looked back at Ruth Ann. Well, Miss Miller, do you know your way around a ledger? I do, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The word was a key turning in a long rusted lock. Good, he said. Be ready in an hour. He put his hat on and walked back to his horse without a backward glance. The matter settled. Her father only agreed because of the money, a portion of which he immediately claimed for himself as a fee for his permission. The town, however, was not so easily bought. When Ruthan walked to the general store to buy a few necessities for her stay, the whispers followed her like flies. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife and the town's primary source of moral judgment, watched her over the top of her spectacles, her mouth a thin, disapproving line. Elsbeth Thorne was there too, buying ribbons with her father, a rival rancher whose land was a fraction of Bridger's. Elsbeth was everything Ruth Ann was not, young, blonde, and cushioned by her father's wealth. She had long considered Bridger her own personal territory to be conquered. She looked at Ruthan's plain dress and calloused hands with open contempt. Imagine, Elsbeth said to her friend, loud enough for the whole store to hear. A man like Mr. Bridger, he could have anyone. Why would he hire that? Ruth Ann kept her eyes on the sack of flour she was buying. She paid her coin, took her parcel, and walked out, her back straight. The whispers were only words. $5 a day was freedom. The Blackwood Ranch was not a home. It was a kingdom. The main house was built of dark, sturdy timber with a porch that ran its entire length, looking out over a valley that seemed to have no end. It was a lonely, magnificent place. Built by a man who trusted land more than people. The inside was cleaned, masculine, and sparse. Books lined the walls of a large office, and a fire burned in a stone hearth that was big enough to stand in. It was a house that was waiting for a life to be lived in it. The housekeeper, Martha, was a stern, gray-haired woman who looked Ruth Ann up and down and seemed to find her acceptable. She showed Ruth Ann to a small, clean room with a simple bed and a window that looked out onto the horse corral. It was more private and peaceful than any space she had ever had. The ledgers were, as Bridger had said, a mess. They were piled on a massive oak desk in his office. A chaotic testament to a man who knew how to earn money but had little patience for tracking it. For the next week, Ruth Ann lived in that office. She rose before dawn, lit the lamp, and began to work, fueled by Martha's strong coffee. She sorted invoices, cross-referenced shipping manifests, and tallied columns of figures that swam before her eyes. The numbers told a story of overcharges, duplicate billings, and outright theft from the Kansas City suppliers. Bridger was being robbed, just as he'd suspected, but she found more than that. She found inefficiency. He was having supplies shipped in separate, smaller loads, paying a premium for each one. She began to draw up a new plan, consolidating orders, charting out more direct supply routes, calculating the savings. Her mind, so long confined to the petty tyrannies of a household budget, reveled in the scale of it. Here, her intelligence was not a liability. It was a tool. Bridger left her alone. He would be gone before she woke and return long after dusk, smelling of horse and dust. He would nod to her in the office, his gray eyes glancing at the growing stacks of neatly ordered papers, but he rarely spoke. She would leave her findings for the day in a concise report on his desk, and in the morning she would find a fresh pot of coffee waiting for her. Long before Martha was awake, it was a silent conversation, an exchange of competence for respect. One evening, a storm blew in, a furious squall that turned the sky black and lashed the windows with rain. She had been so engrossed in her work, she hadn't noticed the time. When she finally looked up, the office was dark save for her lamp, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. She saw Bridger sitting in a leather armchair in the shadows, watching her. She hadn't even heard him come in. "You should stop for the night." "Miss Miller," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual command. "I've almost finished quarterly expense summary," she replied, her pen still poised over the page. He got up and walked to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames leaped up, casting a warm, flickering light across his face, softening the hard lines. "My foreman tells me you work longer hours than he does. He's afraid you'll put him out of a job." A small smile touched her lips. "Tell him his job is safe. I have no talent for roping cattle." He almost smiled back. The expression was unfamiliar on his face, a brief crack in the stone. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the hearth and handed one to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "The storm is bad," he said, looking out the window at the sheets of rain. "You won't make it back to town tonight." She hadn't even thought of it. The ranch had become her world. The town, her father, the whispers, they all seemed a lifetime away. I suppose not. They sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the rain and the crackle of the fire. He asked her about the ledgers, and she explained what she had found, not just the theft, but the opportunities. She spoke of logistics, of bulk purchasing, of seasonal demand. He listened intently, asking sharp, intelligent questions. He was not just a cattleman, he was a builder, an architect of enterprise. For the first time, she was speaking to someone who understood the language of her mind. He found himself talking, too. He spoke of his first years in the territory, of the partner who had betrayed him and nearly ruined him. He spoke of the long, solitary years of rebuilding, of his deep, abiding trust in the land because it was the only thing that had never lied to him. A man with that much land is a king, she said softly, more to herself than to him. And a king is always alone. His eyes met hers across the firelight, and the wall he kept around himself seemed to thin, to become almost transparent. He saw not a plain, aging spinster, but a woman of quiet strength and surprising insight. She saw not a remote, powerful land baron, but a man marked by a deep and lonely wound. The conversation dwindled, but the quiet that replaced it was not empty. It was full of unspoken things. She must have drifted off, her head leaning against the high back of her chair. She woke with a start sometime later to find a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. The lamp on the desk had been turned down low. Bridger was gone. The coffee cup she had used was washed and put away. The fire was banked for the night, its embers glowing a soft, steady red. She pulled the blanket tighter, the scent of leather and wood smoke clinging to it. It was the kindest gesture anyone had made toward her in years. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed cleaned and smelling of wet earth and sage. Bridger found her in the office, as always. "Leave the books for today," he said. It was not a request. "There's something you need to see." He took her riding. He put her on a gentle mare that was as steady as a rocking chair. He led the way on his black stallion, up a winding trail that climbed into the high country. They rode for over an hour. The only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on the trail. He pointed out landmarks, named the different types of grasses, and showed her where the herds would graze in the summer. He was teaching her the geography of his life. Finally, they reached a high ridge. He dismounted and helped her down. Before them, the entire territory was laid out like a map. The Blackwood Ranch was a vast, sprawling tapestry of green and gold, threaded with the silver of creeks and rivers. In the distance, the town was a tiny, insignificant cluster of buildings. "This is it," he said, his voice holding a quiet reverence. "This is everything." He wasn't boasting. He was sharing. "I'm planning to put a new well down over there," he pointed to a shallow basin, "to water the north pasture through the dry season. What do you think?" He was asking for her opinion, not on a ledger, but on the future of his land. She looked at the terrain, her practical mind assessing the slope, the drainage, the distance from the herd. "The ground looks lower to the east," she said, "near that stand of cottonwoods. The water table might be closer to the surface there. You'd save on drilling." He looked at the spot, then back at her, a slow look of surprise and respect dawning on his face. "You might be right." As she turned to look again, her foot slipped on a patch of loose rock. He reached out instantly, his hand closing around her arm to steady her. His grip was strong, sure. His fingers were warm against her skin. It was a simple reflexive action, but it lasted a moment too long. The world seemed to stop. There was only the vast sky above them, the endless land below them, and the solid, warm pressure of his hand on her arm. Neither of them breathed. He dropped his hand as if he'd been burned, a flicker of something dark and unsettled in his eyes. The wall was back up, thicker than before. He was terrified of the feeling, of the need that was beginning to stir in the solitary fortress of his heart. "We should head back," he said, his voice strained. The easy companionship of the morning was gone, replaced by a tense, charged silence that lasted the entire ride back to the ranch. Ruth Ann finished her work on the ledgers 2 days later. She had compiled a thick report detailing the theft and outlining her recommendations for the future. It was a testament to her skill, a document of pure, undeniable competence. She had saved him a fortune. Her work was done. There was no reason for her to stay. The thought left a hollow ache in her chest. She was packing her small bag when Bridger appeared at the door of her room. He looked uncomfortable, his usual authority replaced by a stiff formality. Before he could speak, a rider came in from town at a gallop. It was one of her father's neighbors. "Mr. Bridger, it's Miller. He's in town, telling everyone you've ruined his daughter. He's demanding you marry her, or he'll sue you for every penny you've got." Ruthen felt the blood drain from her face, her father, of course. He saw her value to Bridger not as a source of pride, but as a new asset to be leveraged. At the same time, the whispers from the town had reached a fever pitch. Elsbeth Thorne, furious at the attention Bridger was showing the spinster, had been hard at work. She spread the rumor that Ruth Ann had thrown herself at him, that she had contrived to be stranded at the ranch, that she was a desperate, conniving woman trying to trap the territory's most eligible man. Her father's public demands only seemed to confirm the slander. Bridger's face hardened, the vulnerability she had seen on the ridge completely gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with suspicion. The old wound, the betrayal by his partner, had been torn open. He was a man who had been swindled before, and he saw the shape of a trap closing around him. "This was your plan all along?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "You and your father?" "No," she whispered, horrified. "I knew nothing of this. I would never." "Your work here is finished, Miss Miller," he said, his voice like ice. He pulled a leather pouch from his belt and tossed it on the bed. It landed with a heavy clink of coins. "Your payment, more than we agreed." "For your silence." He turned and walked away without another word. The door to his office slammed shut. The sound echoed the slamming of the door in her heart. She was dismissed, paid off, sent away. He believed the whispers. He believed she was just like everyone else, trying to take something from him. The brief, fragile connection they had built was shattered. Martha drove her back to town in a small buckboard. The housekeeper's face was grim and sad. She said nothing. But as she helped Ruth Ann down in front of her father's house, she pressed her hand for a moment. It was a gesture of solidarity, a small kindness in a world that had suddenly turned cruel. Her father was waiting, his face flushed with triumph. "Our fortune is made, girl. He'll have to marry you now. The richest man in the territory." Ruth Ann walked past him into the house, the coin pouch feeling like a stone in her hand. She put it on the kitchen table. "He paid me for my work," she said, her voice dead. "There will be no wedding. There is nothing." The hope that had bloomed within her over the past weeks withered and died. She was back in the silent, suffocating house. She was back on the shelf. But it was worse now, because now she knew what it felt like to be seen. She knew the warmth of a shared fire, the feel of a steadying hand, the sound of her own thoughts being heard and valued. To have it all snatched away was a pain sharper than any insult. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing down on her, heavier and more permanent than ever before. For 2 days, Ruth Ann moved through her chores in a haze of grief. She didn't cry. The hurt was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Her father raged and plotted, convinced he could still force Bridger's hand, but she ignored him. The world had shrunk back to the 4 walls of his house. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, she went downstairs for a drink of water. A low lamp was lit in the parlor and she heard voices. Her father's and another man's, a slick and oily voice she didn't recognize. She paused in the darkened hallway, listening. "Thorne is in on it, of course," the stranger was saying. "He wants Bridger humbled as much as we want his money. You get Bridger to buy that parcel of scrubland north of here, the one you just acquired. He'll think he's expanding his northern access. And he doesn't know the county is rerouting the main freight road through Thorne's property next. Spring," her father said, his voice thick with greed. "Cutting him off completely, his new land will be worthless. And the only way out will be to pay Thorne's exorbitant toll. We'll ruin him." "And the information about his expansion plans?" the stranger asked. "The ones you said your daughter uncovered?" "Right here," her father crowed. "She's a clever girl, I'll give her that." Wrote it all down for him. And for me. Ruthen leaned against the wall, her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. They were using her work, her mind, to destroy Bridger. Her father was colluding with Thorne, Elsbeth's father, Bridger's biggest rival. They were setting a trap far more insidious than a marriage plot. They were going to bleed him dry, using the very intelligence he had admired in her as the weapon against him. This was her fault. He had trusted her. and she had inadvertently brought this ruin upon him. A cold resolve settled over her. She would not let this happen. She crept back to the kitchen and looked at the ledger she had kept for her father's household accounts. It was her word against theirs. But her father was a meticulous record-keeper of his own petty dealings. Tucked in the back, she found it. A notation of the payment he had received for the Scrubland parcels, with the name of the speculator, the same man now in their parlor. It was proof of his part in the scheme. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. She didn't hesitate. She took the ledger, threw a thin shawl over her shoulders, and slipped out the back door. The moon was high and bright. She ran to the livery, where her father kept his old sway-backed mare. She saddled the horse with trembling hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a woman who had never defied her father, never broken a rule, never acted on her own behalf. But this was not for her. This was for him. She rode out of town, the ledger tucked securely under her arm, pushing the old mare harder than it had ever been pushed before. She was riding to save the man who had cast her aside. Back at the Blackwood Ranch, Bridger sat alone in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. The house was silent, too silent. For years this quiet had been his refuge, his shield. Now it was a tomb. He looked at the neat stacks of paper on his desk, at the report Ruth Ann had written. Her handwriting was clear and precise, like her mind. He read again her notes on the Kansas City suppliers, her plans for the new supply routes. It was brilliant. It was honest. He thought of her face in the firelight, the quiet intelligence in her eyes. He remembered the feel of her arm in his hand on the ridge. He had been a fool. His fear, born of an old betrayal, had made him blind. He had pushed away the one person who had shown him nothing but integrity. What did it matter what her father or the town said? He knew her. He had seen her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He didn't just need her skills. He needed her quiet presence, her steadying calm. He needed her. He stood up, his decision made. He would not let her go. He would ride to town, confront her father, and tell him to go to hell. He would go to her and apologize for his blindness, for his fear. He would ask her to come back, not as an employee, but as his partner, as his wife. He strode out of the house and swung onto his black stallion, turning it toward town, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and dread. They met on the open prairie, halfway between the ranch and the town, a lone rider on a tired horse, silhouetted against the moonlit plains. He recognized her immediately. He spurred his horse forward, his mind racing. Was she leaving for good? She saw him coming, a dark, powerful shape, closing the distance at a terrifying speed. She pulled her mare to a stop, her courage faltering for a moment. He reined in his stallion so hard it reared slightly, its eyes wild. "Ruthin," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even settled. "Bridger, you have to listen," she said, breathless, holding up the ledger like a shield. "It's a trap, my father and Thorne. They're using my work. They're trying to sell you land, to cut off your access, to ruin you." She explained it all, the words tumbling out in a rush, her voice filled with desperate urgency. He listened, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. He took the ledger she offered and glanced at the entry. He saw the proof, he saw the truth, and he saw the immense risk she had taken to bring it to him. She had ridden through the night, defied her father, and come to warn the man who had wounded her so deeply. She had saved him, not from a gunshot or a stampede, but from something far worse. From his own blindness, from a betrayal that would have crippled his empire and broken his spirit. "I know," he said softly. He looked up from the book, and his eyes, stripped of all their walls, were filled with a raw, aching vulnerability. "I was a fool, Ruth Ann. I let my past make me cruel. I let the noise of the town drown out what I knew in my heart to be true. Can you forgive me?" She could only nod. A wave of relief so profound it left her weak. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand. "We're going back to town." "But you're not going back to his house." He helped her down from her tired mare, his hands gentle on her waist. He tethered the mare to his own saddle and then lifted her up onto the stallion, set in front of him. He wrapped one arm securely around her, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest. They rode into town just as the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. He didn't stop at her father's house. He rode directly to the general store, where the early morning gossips, including Mrs. Gable and a sour-faced Elsbeth Thorne, were already gathering. He dismounted and helped Ruthann down, keeping her hand firmly in his. He walked into the store, his presence silencing all conversation. He held up the ledger. "Mr. Miller, in collusion with Mr. Thorne, has attempted to defraud me," he announced, his voice ringing with cold authority. "They used this woman's good work to do it. And this woman," he turned to Ruthann, his grip on her hand tightening, "risked everything to stop them." He looked around at the stunned faces, his gaze finally settling on Elsbeth. "Some people in this town have been spreading lies. Let me tell you the truth." He turned back to Ruthann, and his voice softened. Becoming intensely personal meant only for her, though the whole town was listening. "Her father told me she was too old to wed." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "He was wrong. She's the only woman in this territory wise enough, strong enough, and brave enough to be my wife. She's the only woman I'd ever ask." Then, in the stunned silence of the general store, in front of the very people who had scorned her, Bridger went down on one knee. "Ruthann Miller," he said, his winter-gray eyes full of a warmth she had only dreamed of. "Will you marry me?" Tears finally came, blurring the faces of the shocked townspeople. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming it felt like the breaking of a dam. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." 3 months later, Ruthann stood on the porch of the Blackwood Ranch. It was her home now. The late afternoon sun bathed the valley in a soft golden light. The house was no longer a lonely fortress. It was filled with the sense of baking bread and the sound of quiet laughter. Martha, who had become her staunch friend, hummed in the kitchen. The ranch hands, who had initially been wary, now treated her with a deep and abiding respect. She was not just the boss's wife, she was Mrs. Bridger, and her quiet wisdom had already solved a dozen problems they had wrestled with for years. Bridger came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. He was a different man. The hardness had not disappeared, but it was tempered now with a gentleness she had unearthed. He smiled more. He talked more. He was no longer a king in a lonely castle. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. "About silence," she said. "And how there are more than two kinds." She turned in his arms to face him, placing her hands on his chest. "There's this kind. The quiet at the end of a long day when the work is done and everything is right." He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that spoke of gratitude and a deep, settled love. Her father, disgraced and exposed, had sold his property and moved on, a bitter and diminished man. The Thornes kept to themselves, their power in the town broken. Ruth Ann had found her place not by being chosen, but by choosing to act. She had earned her belonging. "He didn't just look at me like a woman," she thought, looking up at her husband's face. "He looked at me like I was home." Bridger took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I was half dead before you came, Ruth Ann," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. "You saved me from the silence." Together they watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The vast prairie settled into its nightly peace, a clean and gentle quiet that was no longer a lonely promise, but a shared and beautiful life. She had been a woman the world discarded, and he had been a man who had discarded the world. And here, on the edge of the frontier, in the quiet space between them, they had rescued each other. The frontier was still wild, but for the first time in her life, Ruthann was home. She had found her shelter.